In the middle of a heavy downpour, a poor, soaked girl knocked on the door of a luxurious mansion, asking the millionaire to buy a homemade sweet. Annoyed by the interruption, he agreed only to send her away quickly. But as soon as he took the first bite, a familiar taste struck his mind, making him fall to his knees, with tears streaming down his face as he remembered where it came from. The rain fell without mercy on the slate roofs of the Sterling estate, a deluge that seemed to want to drown the world in sorrow. Inside, Arthur Sterling felt as if the storm was merely a reflection of the frozen desert his soul had become. The howl of the wind through the eaves was the soundtrack to his solitude, a constant lament that echoed through the empty corridors and silent halls, where every piece of furniture, covered by a white sheet, looked like a waiting ghost. Seated in his leather armchair before the fireplace that burned without warming, he swirled the glass of bourbon in his hand, watching the amber liquid dance in the flickering light. The fire crackled, but the cold came from within, a cold that had settled in 5 years ago and that no flame could ever melt. On the opposite wall, the oil portrait of Helena watched him, her smile captured in an instant of eternal happiness that was, to him, a daily torture. He raised his glass in a silent toast to the smiling ghost. Pain was his only companion, nostalgia his only lover. The outside world, with its colors and sounds, was an affront to his devotion to grief. He had built walls, not of stone, but of indifference and coldness, to protect himself from any emotion that might desecrate the sanctuary of his loss. It was then that the sound cut through the air, sharp and insistent. A doorbell. Arthur frowned, irritation rising like bile. No one visited him. He had made sure of that. Salesmen were turned away by his security at the main gate, miles from the house. Anyone who dared to approach was met by signs that screamed, "Private property." The bell's insistence was a violation, an invasion of his sacred isolation. With a low growl, he stood up, his body stiff from lack of movement and the rigidity of his soul. He crossed the marble hall, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows in an empty cathedral. The rain beat against the stained glass panels of the door, distorting the small figure waiting outside. With a sharp movement, he pulled open the heavy oak door, ready to unleash his icy fury upon the intruder. But the words died in his throat. Before him, huddled under the useless awning, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. She was soaked, water running from her dark hair plastered to her forehead, forming small puddles at her bare, muddy feet. A thin, faded dress, completely inadequate for the weather, clung to her small frame, which was trembling uncontrollably. In her hands, she held with surprising firmness a small wicker basket, covered by a dishcloth that was also damp. Her eyes, large and a deep brown, stared up at him without fear, with a seriousness that did not belong to a child. Arthur's first reaction was impatience. A peddler, just what he needed. He opened his mouth to send her away, to tell her she was trespassing and should go back to wherever she came from. But something stopped him. It wasn't pity. He hadn't felt pity in a long time. It was something else. A resilience in her posture, a dignity in the way she lifted her chin, defying the storm and the imposing man before her. "Sir," her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the sound of the rain. "Would you like to buy a sweet treat? It was made with a lot of love." She held up the basket, a simple gesture that, for a reason he could not comprehend, seemed to shake the very foundations of his carefully controlled world. The heavy door in his hand suddenly felt like a fragile shield. He wanted to close it, to lock the world out and return to the safety of his familiar pain. But his muscles wouldn't obey. He just stood there, framed in the doorway of his fortress, staring into a pair of eyes that held a storm far older and deeper than the one raging around them. And, for the first time in years, Arthur felt the silence of his house not as peace, but as an abyss staring back at him, waiting for an answer he didn't know if he had the courage to give. For a long moment, Arthur Sterling found himself paralyzed, his hand on the doorknob. The cold wind whipping his face and carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the small intruder before him. His mind, trained to calculate risks and close ruthless deals, struggled to process the situation. It was simple: a child selling sweets. The logical solution was to close the door, ignore her, return to the hollow warmth of his fireplace and the numbing embrace of his bourbon. Yet, his eyes remained fixed on hers. There was an absence of pleading in them. She wasn't begging for a handout. She was offering a product. There was a silent strength there, an integrity that disarmed him. With a sigh of irritation, not at her, but at himself for his hesitation, he decided on the quickest path to restoring his isolation. The transaction, money solved everything, he thought. It was the language he mastered. "How much for the whole thing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended, gesturing with his chin toward the basket. The girl blinked, the raindrops on her eyelashes looking like tiny diamonds. "I'm not selling the whole basket, sir, just the treats, one at a time." The simplicity of her answer frustrated him. He didn't want a dialogue. He wanted an end. Shoving a hand into the pocket of his velvet trousers, he pulled out a thick money clip. Without looking, he peeled off a bill, the largest his fingers found, and held it out to her. "Take it. Keep the basket and go home. It's late and the rain is terrible." It was an order disguised as generosity, an act of power to end the interaction. He expected to see a glint of gratitude, perhaps even astonishment, in the child's eyes. Instead, she shook her head, a firm movement that sent water flying from her hair. "I can't accept that, sir. The treat is just $1. $1. The amount was so insignificant Arthur almost laughed. He, who moved millions with a single signature, was being held at his own door over a matter of a single dollar. Her refusal was a new challenge, an invisible barrier his fortune couldn't seem to breach. A wave of impatience washed over him. "Listen, girl," he began, his voice low and controlled. "I don't have time for this. Just take the money and go." But she didn't move. She just continued to hold the basket, her body trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "It's just, if you don't taste it, you won't know if you like it. And if you don't like it, you don't have to pay." The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. He, Arthur Sterling, was being subjected to a customer satisfaction policy by a child street vendor in the middle of a thunderstorm. A part of him wanted to scream, to slam the door and forget this ever happened, but another part, a part he hadn't listened to in years, was curious. Resigned, he sighed, the sound lost in the roar of the rain. "Fine, give me one." With fingers nimble despite the cold, she removed the damp cloth, revealing small confections carefully wrapped in wax paper. She picked one and held it out to him. His hand, large and marked by time, nearly swallowed the small offering. He held it, feeling the slightly damp paper. As he turned to get his wallet again to give her the exact change, her voice stopped him. "You have to taste it first," she insisted, her voice still soft, but with a thread of steel. "That's the rule." It was made with a lot of love. Exasperated, Arthur looked at the sweet in his hand and then at the girl's serious, expectant face. It was the price he had to pay for his solitude. One small sacrifice to have it back. With a resigned, almost disdainful motion, he unwrapped the confection. A subtle, almost forgotten aroma drifted up to him, a mix of honey, almonds, and something else, something warm and familiar. Ignoring the warning bell that chimed somewhere deep in his memory, he brought the sweet to his lips. The instant he tasted it, the world stopped spinning. The flavor exploded on his tongue, not like sugar, but like a key, unlocking a door that had been bolted for an eternity in the cellar of his heart. Wildflower honey, not the processed, soulless honey from grocery store shelves, but pure honey with a floral, untamed note that only untouched nature could produce. Almonds toasted to the perfect point, releasing their oil and a flavor that was both bitter and sweet. And cinnamon, a special kind of cinnamon, one that warmed the mouth without burning, leaving a fragrant trail that rose through his throat and filled his senses. The combination was a symphony, a gustatory melody that Arthur Sterling had not tasted in 5 years, but that his body and soul recognized instantly. Helena. The name echoed in his mind like thunder, shaking the walls he had so carefully constructed. It was her confection, the secret recipe she had brought from her small hometown, a family treasure passed down through generations. She would make it on special occasions or on ordinary days, just to see him smile. She called it an edible love spell. In that moment, the spell hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The leather armchair, the fireplace, the rain outside, it all disappeared. He was back in their old kitchen, the one consumed by the fire, but which in his memory still smelled of wood and happiness. He saw Helena, her back to him, her hair in a messy bun, humming a lullaby as she stirred a copper pot. He could feel the warmth of the stove, the smell of joy in the air, and then another image, more painful, invaded him. His daughter, little Sophia, with her golden curls, sitting on the counter, her small legs swinging, laughing as she tried to steal a piece of the dough. The memory was so vivid, so real. He reached out to touch her, but his fingers met only the cold, damp night air. The force of the memory buckled his knees, literally. His legs gave way, folding beneath the weight of a grief he had kept dammed up for years. He fell, the dull impact of his knees on the marble echoing through the hall. The rain outside seemed to fall silent, and the only sound was his own ragged breath, which turned into a choked sob. A tear, the first in 5 years, escaped his control and rolled down his cheek, hot as lava. Then another, and another. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from shock. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck inside him, illuminating the darkest, dustiest corners of his heart, revealing everything he had lost, everything he had tried to forget. The girl took a frightened step back, her eyes wide with surprise and concern. She didn't understand what was happening. A moment ago, he was a cold, imposing man. Now he was a broken figure, kneeling in his own doorway, weeping silently. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice a frightened whisper. "Is the treat? Is it bad?" Arthur raised his head, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. He looked at her, but he no longer saw a peddler or an intruder. He saw her through the veil of his memories, and an impossible, desperate question formed in his mind. "Where?" he managed to say, his voice raw and broken. "Where did you get this recipe?" The girl relaxed slightly, seeing that he wasn't in physical pain. She stepped closer again, the innocence in her gaze contrasting brutally with the tempest that raged within Arthur. "My aunt taught me," she said, a touch of pride in her voice. "She said it was our family's recipe, that it came from far away, from a little town called—" She frowned, trying to remember the name she rarely used. Primrose Valley. The name struck Arthur like a second bolt of lightning. Primrose Valley. The small, forgotten town where Helena was born and raised. The place she described as a lost paradise, full of crystal-clear streams and fields of sunflowers. Arthur's world, which was already collapsing, now shattered into 1,000 pieces around him. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was statistically impossible. A storm, a little girl, a sweet treat, and his late wife's hometown, all colliding at his doorstep on a single night. He felt the floor disappear from under him, the past and present merging into a dizzying whirlwind that threatened to swallow him whole. Arthur remained on his knees, the cold of the marble seeping into his trousers, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the ringing in his ears, the echo of the name Primrose Valley ricocheting off the walls of his mind. His head spun with questions that tumbled over one another, each more urgent than the last. Who was this girl? Who was the aunt that had taught her the most precious recipe of his life? The storm inside him was now far more violent than the one outside. He needed answers. He needed air. With a monumental effort, he used the doorframe to pull himself up, his legs still trembling. The girl's face was etched with genuine concern. He saw he had frightened her, but his own emotional turmoil was so great he could barely formulate an apology. Instead, the need to know more took over. "Come in," he said, his voice still hoarse but firm. It was a command, not an invitation. He stepped back, opening the door wider to give her space to pass. The girl hesitated for a second, looking from Arthur's imposing, emotionally unraveled figure to the rainy darkness behind her. The mansion seemed frightening, full of shadows and silence. But the man, despite his strange reaction, didn't seem threatening. He seemed broken, with a courage she didn't understand herself. She took a step inside, treading timidly onto the Persian rug in the entryway. The warmth of the house immediately enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chill that had consumed her. Arthur closed the door, and the sound of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant murmur. The silence in the house was heavy, almost palpable. "Stay here," he ordered, and without waiting for a reply, he strode down a corridor, disappearing into a dark room. The girl stood frozen, clutching her basket to her chest like a shield. She looked around at the marble staircase that swept up into darkness, at the furniture draped in sheets, at the portrait of the beautiful woman on the wall. The house was immense, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum of sleeping memories. Arthur returned moments later, carrying a thick towel and a small wool blanket. He held them out to her, avoiding her gaze. "Dry yourself," he said, his voice controlled again, the mask of coldness beginning to reassemble itself, though cracked. As she dried herself, he watched her, no longer with impatience, but with an almost painful intensity. He searched for features, for resemblances, for anything that might connect this child to his past. Her hair was dark, unlike Sophia's blonde. Her eyes were brown, not blue like his daughter's. But there was something in the shape of her face, in the stubborn curve of her chin. Or perhaps it was just his desperate desire projecting ghosts. "You said your aunt taught you the recipe," he began, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, creating a safe distance, as if she were a flame that might burn him. "Where is she now?" The girl's face fell. The small spark of pride she had shown when speaking of the recipe was extinguished, replaced by a shadow of sorrow. She's gone," she said in a low voice. "A few weeks ago." "Gone where?" Arthur pressed, feeling a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. "She's gone for good," the girl clarified, her voice catching. "The man at the place where I live said she became a star in the sky." The simplicity of the childish explanation hit him hard. The aunt was dead. A sliver of hope he didn't even know he'd been nurturing died with her. He felt like a fool for getting carried away. It was just a tragic coincidence. A recipe that had somehow traveled from a distant relative to this orphan, because that's what she was. An orphan. "The place where you live," he repeated, his mind working furiously. "What place is that?" "The Havenwood Children's Home," she answered, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. "It's off the old highway, past the Iron Bridge." The information struck him. An orphanage. He knew the place. He'd driven past it a few times. An old, somber building that had always given him a chill. The girl lived in an orphanage, alone. Her aunt, her only connection to the past, to the recipe, was gone. He felt himself sinking into a dead end, the small flame of mystery nearly extinguished. But then, as she shifted, the blanket slipped slightly, and something glinted at her neck. A thin silver chain, almost lost against her skin, and hanging from it, a small, heart-shaped locket. A locket Arthur would recognize anywhere, in any lifetime. He had commissioned it himself. It was identical to the one he had given Sophia on her 5th birthday. Shortly before Helena fell ill, shortly before their world collapsed, Arthur's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. He rose, approaching her slowly, like one approaches a wild animal. "May I see that?" he whispered, pointing to the locket. The girl, startled by his sudden intensity, instinctively clapped a hand to her chest, covering the small treasure. It was the only thing she had from her aunt, the only thing that connected her to a time when she felt loved. And the look on this rich, strange man's face was a kind of hunger that terrified her. The fear in the girl's eyes was like a bucket of cold water on Arthur. He took a step back, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender, realizing how frightening he must seem. A grown man, who minutes before was crying on his knees, now advancing with a feverish glint in his eyes. Coveting the only valuable possession she owned, he needed to calm down, to think clearly. His mind, the same mind that built an empire from nothing, began to work, analyzing variables, mapping out strategies. The direct approach had failed. He needed tact, patience. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice now gentle and controlled. "I didn't mean to scare you, it's just that locket reminded me of one I knew, a long time ago." He moved away, sitting back down on the step, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "It's very beautiful. Did your aunt give it to you?" The girl relaxed her hand over her chest, but not completely. She studied him with a wisdom beyond her years, a caution born of necessity. "Yes," she answered, her voice still wary. "She said I should never take it off, that it would protect me and help me find my way." Find my way. The phrase echoed in Arthur's head. Could it be? A sign, a clue left by fate. He pushed the thought away. He needed facts, not foolish hopes. Facts were concrete, and the first fact he needed was this child's name. "My name is Arthur," he said, offering a piece of himself in the hope of getting something in return. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment. At the home, they taught her not to talk to strangers, not to give her name. But this man didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He had let her in, given her a towel and a blanket, and he had cried when he tasted her sweet. There was a connection there, something she didn't understand but felt. "Lena," she said finally. "My name is Lena." Lena, a simple, pretty name. It wasn't Sophia. The disappointment was a sharp pang, but he hid it. Of course, it wouldn't be Sophia. If she were his daughter, she would have been found, registered with her given name. The reality was far more complex. The next morning, the first thing Arthur did was call his lawyer and private investigator, a man named Harris, known for his discretion and efficiency. He gave no details, only the essentials. He wanted to know everything about a girl named Lena at the Havenwood Children's Home. He wanted to know her origins, how she got there, who her parents were, and, above all, he wanted the name of the aunt who had recently passed away. The obsession consumed him. His routine of seclusion was shattered. He could no longer sit in his armchair, staring at the fire. He paced the mansion, his mind racing. Every face in the family portrait seemed to watch him, to question him. Helena, in her oil painting, seemed to have a glint of expectation in her eyes. He visited the orphanage that same day. Havenwood Children's Home was the opposite of its name, a grey building with bars on the windows and an air of neglect that crushed the soul. He was met by a director, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Davison, whose forced smile didn't hide her weary eyes and defensive posture. Arthur, using all his power and influence, tried to be diplomatic. He said he had met one of the girls, Lena, and had been touched by her story. He wanted to help, perhaps make a generous donation, but he needed some information first. Mrs. Davison stiffened. "Mr. Sterling, we appreciate your generosity, but information about our children is strictly confidential. It's our policy to protect them." "I understand," Arthur said, his patience wearing thin, "but I'm trying to help. I need to know where she came from." Lena was found wandering alone near the bus station about 3 years ago, the director said, reciting the information as if reading from a report. She was malnourished and frightened. There were no documents, and she either couldn't or wouldn't say much about her past. Her records are scarce. Scarce. The word was a brick wall. He pushed, he argued, he offered more money, but Mrs. Davison was unyielding. The privacy and safety of the children came first. He left frustrated, the first major barrier erected in his path. Bureaucracy, institutional protection, they were enemies his money couldn't easily defeat. He returned to his empty mansion, feeling helpless. The feeling was foreign to him. He was used to getting what he wanted. But the truth about Lena was locked away in files and policies he couldn't break. That night, sleep eluded him. He went up to the attic, a place he hadn't visited in years. He opened an old wooden trunk, the smell of mothballs and dust filling the air. Inside, among Helena's clothes and Sophia's toys, was the box of documents he had managed to save from the fire that destroyed their old house. The fire that had happened months after Helena's death, during the worst period of his collapse, when he could barely remember his own days. He searched desperately for any record of Sophia. Birth certificate, medical records, anything he could use to prove a connection. But there was nothing. The box contained only old business papers and a few photos damaged by smoke. He remembered, with a knot in his stomach, that the most important documents had been in a safe in his old home office. A safe the fire had turned into a useless, twisted block of metal. He was at a dead end. Without the orphanage's records and without his own documents, how could he prove anything? Doubt began to eat at him. Maybe he was going mad. Maybe the grief was making him see connections where none existed. Maybe the locket was just a sad coincidence. Exhausted, he sat on the attic floor, surrounded by the ghosts of his lost life, feeling the hope that had been born on that rainy night begin to fade. The next few days dragged on in a fog of frustration for Arthur. Every door he tried to open, he found a stronger lock. Harris, his investigator, returned with vague, inconclusive reports. The orphanage was a fortress of confidentiality. Public records for a girl named Lena were non-existent before her arrival at Havenwood. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. The only concrete lead was the deceased aunt. If only he knew her name. But Lena, during a brief visit Arthur managed at the orphanage under the pretext of discussing a donation, couldn't say. To her, she was just Auntie. This barrier, however, didn't stop Arthur. It only forced him to think differently. If he couldn't get through the wall, he would have to go around it. He changed the focus of his investigation. Instead of searching for Lena, he instructed Harris to scour all death records in the region from the past few weeks, looking for women who lived alone and might have come from Primrose Valley. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it was the only thread he had. While he waited, an uncomfortable idea began to form in his mind. He was so focused on the girl that he had overlooked a crucial detail: the recipe. Helena wasn't the only one who knew it. She always said it was a family tradition. That meant other people, her relatives, might know it, relatives he had never bothered to get to know. When he married Helena, he had plucked her from her humble world and brought her into his, one of luxury and opulence. He barely knew her family, a handful of distant cousins and uncles who had attended their wedding with awestruck eyes and simple clothes. After her death, he had closed himself off completely, severing all ties to her past, finding them too painful. Now, he bitterly regretted that decision. He dove into old photo albums, searching faces, trying to remember names. It was in a wedding photo, in the corner, almost out of focus, that he saw her, a young woman with the same expressive eyes as Helena, smiling at the bride. He vaguely remembered her, a cousin. The name escaped him. Clara? Claudia? Something like that. He gave the photo to Harris. "To find this woman, find out everything about her." The waiting was torture. To fill the void, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He started visiting the places he used to go with Helena. The little cafe downtown, the park where they used to walk. He wasn't looking for her, but for a feeling, a memory of who he was before grief turned him into a statue of ice. It was on one of these outings that he saw Lena again. She was with a group of children from the orphanage in a public square, supervised by a caregiver. She was sitting on a bench, slightly apart from the others, drawing in a sketchbook with a piece of charcoal. He watched her from a distance, his heart aching. She looked so small, so alone in the middle of the crowd. There was a melancholy about her that he recognized, for he saw it every day in the mirror. The caregiver was distracted for a moment, and Lena, spotting a lone flower growing in a crack in the pavement, got up to pick it. As she bent down, her locket swung out from under her dress, glinting in the afternoon sun. Just then, an older boy, running without looking, slammed into her. Lena fell, her sketchbook and charcoal flying. The boy didn't even stop to apologize. Arthur felt a surge of protective fury, an emotion he thought was dead inside him. He started to rise, ready to intervene, but he stopped. Lena got up on her own, brushed the dust from her scraped knee, and instead of crying, went straight to the flower, which had been trampled. With infinite delicacy, she tried to straighten the small flower's broken stem. Her face showed no anger, only a deep sadness for the destroyed beauty. That small gesture, that quiet selflessness, hit him harder than any tears would have. That was the essence of Helena, the same compassion, the same ability to see beauty in small, broken things. In that moment, Arthur's doubt evaporated. Logic and facts might be against him, but his heart, an organ he had ignored for so long, was screaming a truth he could no longer deny. That girl somehow belonged in his world. The call from Harris came the next evening. The investigator sounded different, his usual professional calm replaced by a tone of restrained excitement. "Mr. Sterling, I think I've found something. Several things." "Actually." "Go on," Arthur commanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. "First, your wife's cousin in the photo. Her name is Clara Mayhew. She moved to this area about 10 years ago, lived a very quiet life." "And," Arthur pressed, impatient, "and sir, we found a death certificate for a Clara Mayhew, dated just over a month ago. Cause of death was a sudden illness, and according to neighbors, she didn't live alone. She was raising a young niece, a girl who, after Clara's death, was taken to the Havenwood Children's Home." The room seemed to spin around Arthur. Clara, Helena's cousin, she was the aunt. The connection was made. The missing piece clicked into place. But what Harris said next was what turned suspicion into a shocking certainty. "But that's not all, sir. Clara Mayhew's address was in Primrose Valley. She never moved here. She died there. The girl was found here, hundreds of miles away. Someone brought her and abandoned her." Harris's revelation was a shockwave that coursed through Arthur's body, leaving him breathless. Lena wasn't from here. She was from Primrose Valley, Helena's hometown, and she hadn't gotten lost. She had been brought to the city and abandoned. The question that rose from the chaos of his thoughts was brutal in its simplicity. Why? Who would bring an orphaned child hundreds of miles just to leave her to fend for herself near a bus station? It made no sense, unless the goal wasn't to abandon her, but to leave her in a specific place, near a specific someone, near him. The idea was so absurd and yet so terrifyingly logical that a chill ran down Arthur's spine. Was it possible that Clara, Helena's cousin, knowing she was terminally ill, had devised a desperate plan for the girl to find the only relative who could care for her, and that something in that plan had gone terribly wrong? He had to go to Primrose Valley. He had to see it with his own eyes, breathe the air Helena had breathed, walk the land she came from. He had to find the roots of this story, the missing pieces to the puzzle his life had become. Leaving strict instructions for Harris to keep investigating who might have transported Lena, Arthur left the next morning. The drive was long, hours on a highway that snaked through mountains and valleys, leaving the concrete jungle of the city behind and delving into an older, greener America. As he drew closer, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. He had never been there, but Helena had described every bend in the river, every hill covered in sunflowers, with such love that he felt as if he were coming home. Primrose Valley was exactly as she had painted it. A small town frozen in time with a central square, a white steepled church, and colorful houses with flowering porches. The air was clean and smelled of jasmine and damp earth. It was a place of peace, a violent contrast to the storm in his heart. He found Clara's house easily. It was a humble but neat little cottage, with a small front garden now overgrown with neglect. A neighbor, a white-haired woman with curious eyes, told him about Clara. She spoke of her kindness, her quiet life, and above all, her devoted love for her niece, Lena. A girl as sweet as the honey Clara used to make, the old woman said. After Clara passed, it was such a shame. No one really knew what happened. One day, a fancy car from out of town pulled up. A man talked to the little girl and took her away. We all thought it was a relative coming to get her. A man, a car from out of town. The clue was crucial. Arthur spent the rest of the day in the small town, talking to people, showing Lena's picture. Everyone knew her, everyone loved her. And they all told the same story, the loving aunt, the famous local sweet recipe, and the sudden departure with a stranger, but it was in the small local general store, while buying a bottle of water, that fate intervened. The owner, a stout, talkative man, recognized Arthur from somewhere. Aren't you Helena's husband? Our Helena who married the rich man from the city, Arthur confirmed, surprised to be recognized. Of course you are, the man boomed, smiling. Your wife was the pride of this town. Before she left for good, she came to say goodbye, and she left something for me, said it was important, that maybe one day family would come looking for answers. The man ducked behind the counter and returned with a dusty wooden box. He opened it, revealing a stack of letters tied with a faded satin ribbon and a small leather-bound journal. They're hers, the man said. Helena asked me to keep them safe, said they were insurance for the future. With trembling hands, Arthur took the letters. Helena's elegant script greeted him from the first page, and his heart stopped. He opened the journal. The first page contained a single sentence, written with an urgency that reached across time. If you are reading this, Arthur, it is because the worst has happened, and I could not protect our daughter. But I have left a path for her to find her way back to you, a path of breadcrumbs, like in the fairy tales, except my breadcrumbs are not made of bread. They taste of our family. Arthur felt the floor give way. Helena knew. She had foreseen something. She had left a plan, a map, and he had never known. But the true revelation, the blow that altered the course of everything, was in the last letter of the stack, addressed not to him, but to Clara. With his heart in his throat, he read it. My dearest cousin, I entrust you with my greatest treasure. I know that Arthur, blinded by his grief, will be unable to see her. He will shut down. He will drown. So I am asking you to take her, to raise her away from his sorrow. Give her your love. Teach her our traditions, our recipe. But when she is old enough to understand, or if anything should happen to you, promise me you will help her find her way back. Promise me she will know that her name is not Lena. Tell her that her real name is Sophia. The name Sophia, in Helena's handwriting, was more than a revelation. It was a detonation. Arthur gripped the letter so tightly, the thin paper nearly tore. The air seemed to have been stolen from his lungs, and he leaned against the store counter to keep from falling. Sophia, not Lena. Sophia. It was her. All doubt, logic, and uncertainty were swept away by an overwhelming wave of certainty. The girl who had knocked on his door on that stormy night was not a stranger, not a coincidence. She was his daughter, his Sophia, the one he had thought was lost forever. The store owner, noticing Arthur's pallor, offered him a glass of water. He drank it without tasting, his eyes fixed on the letter. Helena had planned it all. She had known the depths of his grief, the way he would close himself off from the world. In an act of desperate love and painful foresight, she had orchestrated their daughter's safety, placing her in Clara's care, far from the atmosphere of mourning she knew would consume her house and her husband. The pain of losing Helena mixed with a new pain, that of guilt. He had failed. He had sunk so deep into his own suffering that he had become blind, unable to protect the one thing Helena had left him. He had abandoned her, even if he hadn't known it. He had allowed his daughter to grow up an orphan, believing she was someone else, while he lived just miles away, locked in his marble mansion. The shame burned inside him. He spent the rest of the day and night in a small motel in town, reading every word Helena had written. The letters and journal told a story of love, fear, and sacrifice. They revealed the depth of Helena's intuition about his own emotional fragility. She didn't blame him. She understood him. And because she understood him, she acted. The strange man who had taken Sophia from Primrose Valley now made sense. Clara, feeling her death approach, must have hired someone to fulfill her promise to Helena, to bring Sophia to the big city, hoping that fate, or the recipe, would do the rest. But the plan was flawed. The middleman, perhaps out of greed or negligence, had simply dropped her at the bus station, taken his payment, and disappeared. The journey that should have ended in a reunion had turned into years of neglect in an orphanage. With the truth in his hands, a new urgency seized Arthur. He had to go back. He had to tell Sophia who she was. He had to repair the lost years. But how do you tell a little girl that her entire life, her name, her story has been a lie? How do you explain that he, her father, was nearby all along, but never looked for her? The emotional complexity of the situation was a labyrinth. He couldn't just show up at the orphanage and claim her. He was, for all intents and purposes, a stranger, a wealthy stranger who had suddenly taken an interest in one specific orphan. His actions would be viewed with suspicion. He needed irrefutable proof. Proof that went beyond letters and a newly awakened father's heart. The first great turning point of the story had happened inside him. But the outside world still needed to be convinced. He called Harris, his voice charged with a new authority. "Harris, forget everything else. I know who she is. She's my daughter. Sophia, I need a DNA test, now." The order was given with the certainty of a king, but Harris's reply brought him crashing back to reality. "Mr. Sterling, that's extraordinary. But obtaining a DNA sample from a minor in an institution without a court order or the consent of her legal guardians is impossible. Mrs. Davison would never allow it." The first real obstacle on his path to reunification stood before him, tall and impassable. The very institution that was supposed to protect his daughter was now keeping him from her. The irony was cruel. He, who could move mountains with his financial power, was being blocked by rules and regulations. This battle would not be fought with money, but with patience, strategy, and, hardest of all for him, with his heart. He returned to his city the next day, no longer a man in mourning, but a father on a mission. The mansion didn't seem so empty anymore. Now, in every room, he imagined Sophia's laughter. He saw her small form running down the halls. The house was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home waiting to be filled. His first visit was again to the orphanage. This time, he didn't come as a potential donor, but as a volunteer. He offered to fund the renovation of the library and to tutor the children in math. Mrs. Davison looked at him with suspicion, but the offer was too good to refuse. He needed to get closer. He needed to earn the trust of Sophia, or Lena, as she still knew herself. He needed to build a bridge across the 5-year chasm that separated them before he could even tell her the truth. He saw her in the recreation room. She was sitting alone, as usual, with her sketchbook. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he didn't just see a resilient little girl or a memory of his wife. He saw his daughter, and in her brown eyes, he saw the same loneliness that inhabited his own, and he knew, with a painful clarity, that the journey to heal her heart would be the only way to heal his. Arthur Sterling's transformation was subtle to the outside world, but cataclysmic within. The man who once moved through his mansion like a ghost now had a purpose that propelled him beyond its walls. The orphanage library became his sanctuary and his battlefield. He didn't just fund the renovation, he took an active part in it, spending hours among paint cans and stacks of new books, the scent of wood and paper replacing the aroma of bourbon and dust in his home. His constant presence at Havenwood was an anomaly. The children, at first, regarded him with a mixture of awe and fear. He was the rich man, a figure from a distant world. But Arthur, guided by a paternal instinct he didn't know he possessed, ignored the adults and focused on the children. He learned their names, asked about their dreams. For Sophia, however, his approach was different, more cautious. He watched her from afar, respecting her space, her silence. He saw how she retreated from the loud groups, preferring the company of her drawings. The first bridge he built was through art. On one of his volunteer days, he found her in the corner of the newly refurbished library, sketching the same trampled flower he had seen her try to save in the square. He approached silently and placed beside her, without a word, a box of professional-grade colored pencils, with dozens of shades she had likely never seen. Sophia looked up, startled. She stared at the box, then at Arthur's face. There was a silent question in her eyes. "I thought a talent like yours deserved the right tools," he said softly, and walked away, leaving her with the gift. He watched her from a distance. After a few minutes of hesitation, she opened the box. A small smile, the first he had seen her give, touched her lips as her fingers explored the colors. It was a small victory, but to Arthur it felt monumental. Slowly, he began to sit near her during reading sessions, not to talk, but just to share the silence. He brought books about art, about famous gardens, about faraway places. He didn't push her to speak, just created a safe space where she could be herself. It was she who broke the silence first. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one day, not taking her eyes off the drawing she was coloring. "Doing what?" Arthur replied, his heart quickening. "Being nice, bringing things, coming here every day." Arthur thought for a moment, searching for the most honest answer he could give without revealing the truth. "Because you remind me of someone I loved very much," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "Someone who also saw the beauty in small, broken things." Sophia stopped coloring and looked at him. For the first time, she didn't see the rich man or a strange benefactor. She saw the sadness in his eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. "The lady in the painting?" she asked, remembering the portrait on his mansion wall. "Yes," Arthur answered. "My wife, Helena. She's gone too, isn't she?" Sophia whispered, the question more of a statement. "Yes, she's gone too." In that moment, an invisible bond formed between them, a bond forged in shared loss. She didn't know they were mourning the same woman, but their hearts recognized the same pain in each other. Sophia's trust began to blossom. She started showing him her drawings, telling him small things about her day, and Arthur, for the first time in years, learned to listen. He didn't offer solutions or money. He offered his attention, his time. He was learning how to be a father, starting from scratch. However, the shadow of legal reality loomed over them. Harris confirmed that the only way to get a DNA test would be to initiate a formal paternity claim, which would alert the authorities and Potentially age other relatives, the news that followed was a blow. "Mr. Sterling," Harris said over the phone, "my investigation into your late wife's family has turned something up. It seems some distant cousins, upon hearing of Clara's death, have started stirring. They know Clara was caring for a niece, and knowing your fortune, they're starting to ask questions. I suspect that if you file a claim, they'll show up to contest custody, motivated not by love for the girl, but by an interest in your estate." The second major obstacle materialized. It was no longer just the orphanage's bureaucracy, but the greed of strangers. His fortune, which had always been his greatest weapon, was now his greatest vulnerability, attracting vultures who could threaten his reunion with Sophia. The battle for his daughter was about to become public and ugly, and he knew he would have to expose his life, his failings, and his pain to everyone's scrutiny if he wanted a chance to call her daughter again. And he feared that in the middle of that hurricane, the fragile trust he was building with Sophia could be shattered forever. The threat from distant relatives acted as a catalyst for Arthur. Time, once an enemy he tried to kill with bourbon and solitude, was now a precious, dwindling commodity. He couldn't wait for the greed of others to dictate his moves. He had to act, but with a strategy that would protect Sophia from the legal drama to come. The key, he realized, was not to fight them in court, at least, not yet. The key was Sophia herself. If he could get her DNA discreetly, the scientific proof would be his most powerful weapon, capable of ending any dispute before it truly began. But how to get the sample without raising suspicion? The answer came from one of his conversations with the girl. She mentioned, with the casual sadness of a child accustomed to lack, that she had never had a real birthday party. The date the orphanage had assigned her always passed without notice. The idea ignited in Arthur's mind, brilliant and risky. He went to Mrs. Davison with a proposal. "I'd like to sponsor a large spring festival for all the children," he said, "with bouncy castles, food, music, a day for them to forget everything and just be kids." The director, who by now saw Arthur less as an eccentric millionaire and more as a genuine benefactor, gratefully accepted. During the party, amidst the joy and controlled chaos, Arthur planned his move. He hired an event company that, among its various activities, offered a fun science station where kids could do small experiments. One of these experiments would involve collecting a saliva sample on a cotton swab to see their cells under a microscope. It was an elaborate, almost conspiratorial plan, but it was the only way he could shield Sophia from the trauma of an invasive court process. The party was a resounding success. The orphanage grounds, usually grey and quiet, exploded with colour and laughter. Arthur watched from a safe distance, his heart torn between the joy of seeing Sophia smile and the anxiety of his secret plan. He saw her in line for the science station, curious and excited. He saw the attendant, a nurse hired by Harris, disguised as a party entertainer, collect the sample with a smile. He saw the small tube labeled Lena and discreetly pocketed. His heart hammered in his chest. The most crucial step had been taken. While the sample was rushed to a private lab for an urgent test, Arthur allowed himself, for the first time, to enjoy the moment. He approached Sophia, who was eating a cotton candy cloud nearly the size of her head. "Are you having fun?" he asked, a genuine smile on his face. She nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full of sugar. "It's the best day of my life." The simple words hit him with the force of a revelation. He, who had lived in a world of extravagant luxuries, realized that the greatest joy he had ever felt came from providing a happy day for a child with some sugar and a few balloons. It was a humbling lesson that shook him to his core. In the days that followed, as he awaited the test results, their relationship deepened. He took her, with Mrs. Davison's permission, on outings beyond the orphanage. They went to a museum, a zoo, an ice cream parlor. With each trip, he discovered a new piece of her, her endless curiosity, her quiet humor, her compassion for all living things. And she discovered a new piece of him, his patience, his clumsy kindness, the sadness that sometimes veiled his eyes. It was on one of these outings, sitting on a park bench, that she asked him the question he dreaded most. "Mr. Arthur," she began, her voice serious, "my Aunt Clara, she used to tell me stories about a cousin of hers who lived in the big city, a cousin who married a very rich man and had a little girl." Arthur felt his blood run cold. He knew where this was going. "That cousin," Sophia continued, "she was your wife, wasn't she? Helena." He could only manage a nod, his throat dry. Sophia looked down at her own small hands in her lap. Auntie said her little girl got lost, that her father became very, very sad. She looked up, and her gaze was so piercing, so full of an ancient wisdom, that Arthur felt as if she could see right through him, straight into his soul. "Do you still miss her, your little girl?" The question was not an accusation. It was an invitation to share his pain. And Arthur, who had built his life on the bedrock of control, felt his defenses crumble. "Every single day," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I have never stopped missing her. Not for a second." In that moment, he was not the millionaire and she was not the orphan. They were just two lonely souls on a park bench, connected by a loss they both felt, but only one of them fully understood. And as he looked at her, silent tears forming in his eyes, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Harris. The DNA results were in. The phone's vibration in Arthur's pocket was like a fire alarm, shrill and urgent, shattering the intimate bubble that had formed around him and Sophia on the park bench. For an instant, he hesitated to answer. This moment of connection was so rare, so precious, he feared the reality of the outside world would splinter it. But the need to know, the urgency that had consumed him for weeks, was stronger. With a whispered apology to Sophia, he moved a few steps away, turning his back to give her privacy, though he could feel her eyes on him. "Harris, go ahead," he answered, his voice tense. "The results are in, sir," the investigator said. There was a dramatic pause, and Arthur held his breath. "It's a 99.99% match. There is no doubt. The girl known as Lena is your daughter, Sophia Sterling." Arthur's world tilted on its axis. He squeezed his eyes shut. One hand braced against a nearby tree for support. It was one thing to know it in his heart, to believe it with his entire soul. It was another thing entirely to have the cold, irrefutable confirmation of science. The joy that bubbled up in his chest was so intense, it was nearly suffocating, but it was immediately followed by a wave of panic. Now what? The proof was his, but the hardest, most dangerous part of his journey was just beginning. He pocketed the phone, his brain working at dizzying speed. He needed a plan. He needed to tell her, but how? Where? The truth was a time bomb, and he had to be sure that when it detonated, it wouldn't destroy her. He turned back to Sophia. She was still watching him, her head tilted slightly, an expression of concern on her face. She was so fragile, and yet so strong. He knelt in front of her, bringing their eyes to the same level. "Sophia," he said. The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. It was a slip, a Freudian slip freighted with years of longing. She frowned, confused. "My name is Lena. I know. I'm sorry," he corrected himself quickly, his heart racing. "Lena, I have something very important to tell you, something that will change everything, but it can't be here. Can we go to my house?" The mention of the mansion, that big, silent place, frightened her a little. But there was an urgency in Arthur's voice, a vulnerability in his eyes that made her agree. During the car ride, a heavy silence filled the space between them. Arthur drove with his knuckles white on the steering wheel, rehearsing and discarding 1,000 ways to begin the conversation. Sophia stared out the window, sensing the tension in the air, a premonition that her small, ordered life was about to be turned upside down. When they arrived at the estate, he didn't lead her to the formal living room, but to the kitchen. It was the heart of the house, the place where Helena had created her magic. He sat Sophia on a high stool at the island, the very place where, in his memories, she used to sit. He began to speak, not with the story of his loss, but with the story of her love. He told her about Helena, about how she lit up every room she entered. He showed her photographs, and taken from an album he had brought down from the attic, pictures of a pregnant Helena, pictures of him holding a newborn baby, pictures of a happy family. "This baby," Arthur said, pointing to a photo, his voice trembling, "she was the most precious thing in our world. We named her Sophia." Sophia stared at the photos, her eyes wide, absorbing every detail. She saw the love in the couple's eyes, the joy radiating from them. "After your mother, after Helena was gone," Arthur continued, his voice cracking, "I got lost. Grief was an ocean, and I drowned in it. I couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything but the loss. And in that chaos, I lost you, too." He paused, gathering all his courage for the final words. He took the DNA test results from his pocket and laid them on the counter. He didn't have to explain what they were. He just looked into her eyes and let his own gaze convey the truth. "Your Aunt Clara protected you. She kept you safe, just like your mother asked. But she never got the chance to tell you the truth. The truth, Lena, is that you weren't lost. You were here all along. The truth is that your name is Sophia, and I am your father." The silence that followed was the longest and most deafening of Arthur's life. Sophia looked from the paper to his face, her chin trembling, her eyes filling with a storm of emotions he couldn't decipher: shock, disbelief, fear, and, what terrified him most, a shadow of pain and betrayal. She slid off the stool, taking a step back, as if his words had physically pushed her away. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true. My parents abandoned me. Everyone knows that." "No!" Arthur took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "I never abandoned you. I was sick with grief. I was blind, but I never stopped loving you." But his words didn't reach her. The story she had constructed to survive, that of an abandoned girl who had to be strong for herself, was the only truth she knew. Arthur's revelation wasn't a salvation, it was a demolition. He wasn't her long-lost father. He was the man who had left her alone for all those years. With a sob that tore through Arthur's chest, Sophia turned and ran. She ran out of the kitchen, through the marble hall, and toward the front door, the same door she had knocked on weeks ago, selling sweets. She threw it open and ran out into the encroaching darkness, fleeing not from a stranger, but from the devastating truth he represented. The sight of Sophia running into the night was like a knife in Arthur's heart. The echo of her small footsteps on the marble and the thud of the closing door reverberated through the mansion like the sound of his world breaking for a second time. For a moment, the same paralysis that had gripped him for 5 years threatened to take hold again. The pain of rejection was so sharp, so overwhelming, that his first instinct was to retreat, to shut down, to return to the familiar safety of his sorrow. But then, something changed. The image of Helena's face in her portrait flashed in his mind, not with a passive smile, but with a defiant gaze. He was no longer the same man who had drowned in self-pity. He was a father, and his daughter needed him, even if she didn't know it yet. Adrenaline replaced despair. He sprinted after her, his heart hammering against his ribs. Night had fallen quickly, and the vast estate was shrouded in shadows. "Sophia!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. "Sophia, wait, please!" There was no answer. Panic began to set in. The grounds were enormous, full of places a small child could hide or get hurt. He ran toward the gardens, the path lit only by the faint light from the mansion's windows. Every shadow seemed a danger. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a threat. He found her near the old oak tree at the back of the garden, Helena's favorite tree. She was huddled at the base of the trunk, her arms wrapped around her knees, her body shaking with silent sobs. She looked so small and vulnerable against the immensity of the tree and the night. Arthur approached slowly. With the care of one approaching a wounded bird, he didn't touch her. He just sat on the damp ground a respectful distance away. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice soft, broken. "I know you're confused and angry. You have every right to be." She didn't answer, but her sobs lessened slightly. He took it as a sign to continue. "I have no excuse for my failure, Sophia," he said, the word failure heavy on his tongue. "When your mother left, the light in my world went out, and instead of looking for a switch, I got used to the darkness. I was a coward. I hid from life. I hid from my own pain, and in the process I hid from you. And for that, I will spend the rest of my life asking for your forgiveness." He took out his wallet, and from it, a small, worn photograph folded at the corners. It was a picture of him and a 5-year-old Sophia, both covered in chocolate cake, laughing at the camera. He had put it in his wallet the day it was taken and had never removed it, even on the worst days when looking at it was torture. He placed it gently on the ground between them. "I never forgot you," he whispered. "Not for one day. I didn't know how to find you, because the truth is, I was lost, too." Sophia slowly raised her head, her eyes, red and swollen, fixed on the photograph. She picked it up with trembling fingers. The image was from a time before her memory, a glimpse into a world that had been stolen from her. She looked at the smiling man in the photo and then at the broken figure sitting before her. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Why didn't you look for me? If you loved me, why didn't you look?" The question was the purest, most honest expression of her pain. It was the question that would haunt Arthur forever. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, the confession tearing at his soul. "I was afraid that if I found you, the pain of losing your mother would become too real to bear. I was afraid I wouldn't be enough for you. I was afraid I would hurt you with my sadness. It was a selfish, terrible fear, and it cost me 5 years of your life. It cost me you." The brutal honesty of his confession hung in the air. He wasn't trying to justify himself. He was baring his soul, his flaws, his weakness. He was giving her the truth, however ugly it was. Sophia looked at the photo in her hands, at the locket on her chest, and at the face of the man who was crying silently before her. In her small heart, a war was being waged. The pain of abandonment against the truth of a love that, though flawed and lost, had never truly died. Slowly, very slowly, she reached out her hand, not to comfort him, not yet, but to touch the photograph he held. A small gesture that acknowledged the existence of that shared past. And in that touch, in that fragile moment under the old oak tree, a bridge began to be built over the chasm of pain and time that separated them. The battle for her trust was far from over, but the first and most important surrender had taken place, his own. He had surrendered to the truth of his own cowardice, and in doing so, opened the door to the possibility, however small, of forgiveness. The walk back from the darkness of the garden to the light of the mansion was silent, but no longer heavy. Arthur's confession under the oak tree had not erased Sophia's pain, but it had validated it. He had not tried to justify the unjustifiable. He had admitted his failure, and that vulnerability was the first brick in the rebuilding of their relationship. In the days that followed, the mansion began to transform. Arthur, with Sophia's help, began removing the white sheets from the furniture, letting sunlight stream in and touch the dusty surfaces for the first time in years. Each uncovered object was a story. A small grand piano in the corner of the living room, where Helena used to play lullabies, a toy box in Sophia's old room filled with dolls and building blocks. Reliving these memories was painful for Arthur, but it was a different kind of pain, a cleansing pain rather than a festering one. It was the price he had to pay to win back his daughter's trust, and he paid it gladly. The legal battle, however, erupted like an unavoidable storm. As Harris had predicted, the moment Arthur filed for custody, the distant cousins emerged, represented by an aggressive lawyer who painted Arthur as an unstable, negligent recluse trying to claim a vulnerable child for selfish reasons. The first hearing was a disaster. The opposing counsel used Arthur's isolation, his history of deep mourning, and the fact that he hadn't searched for his daughter for 5 years as weapons against him. The judge, a stern, skeptical man, looked at Arthur with clear suspicion. Arthur felt despair creeping back in. The system that was meant to protect his daughter was being manipulated by greed, and his own history made him the perfect villain. He realized that the DNA proof and his fortune wouldn't be enough. The final decision would not rest on facts or laws, but on something far more powerful, Sophia's will. A second hearing was scheduled, and this time Sophia would be heard by the judge in his private chambers. The night before was the longest of Arthur's life. He didn't try to coach her or tell her what to say. He just sat with her in the kitchen, the place that had become the center of their new world. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice calm despite the storm in his chest. "You're going to talk to a man who will decide where you're going to live. I want you to know, no matter what you say, no matter what you decide, I will never, ever stop loving you. If you choose to stay with me, I will spend every day trying to be the father you deserve. If you choose differently, I will understand, and I will still love you." Sophia listened in silence, her face serious. She said nothing, but reached out and took his hand. The next day at the courthouse, Arthur waited outside the judge's chambers, his heart an anvil in his chest. The minutes crawled by like hours. When the door finally opened and Sophia emerged, accompanied by a counselor, her face was calm, unreadable. It was the judge who delivered the news. He called Arthur and the lawyers into his chambers. His expression, once severe, was now softer, more thoughtful. "I've heard what the girl has to say," the judge began. "She told me about her Aunt Clara, about selling sweets in the rain. She told me about you, about how you cried when you tasted her confection." The judge paused, looking directly at Arthur. "But what decided this matter for me was what she said at the end. I asked her why she would want to stay with a father who had abandoned her for so long. And she told me he wasn't abandoning me, he was just lost. And now, we've found each other." The simplicity and depth of those words hit Arthur with the force of a wave. The wisdom and forgiveness of a 10-year-old child had overcome all legal logic and adult greed. The judge granted Arthur temporary custody with monitoring from social services, a formality they both knew would be met with success. The victory in court was immense, but the real victory happened on the way home. In the car, Sophia turned to him. "Dad," she said. Testing the word, it sounded both strange and perfectly natural. Arthur felt tears welling up, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "Yes, sweetheart. Can we make those sweets together?" It was a simple request, but it held the meaning of the world. It wasn't just about baking. It was about honoring Helena's memory, not as a ghost of the past, but as a living presence in their lives. It was about creating new memories, about healing the wound that bound them together. "Yes," Arthur answered, his voice thick with emotion. "We can make all the sweets in the world." And for the first time, he wasn't just existing, he was building a future where his wife's love would live on, through the love he and his daughter were finally learning to share. 4 weeks had passed since the storm brought Sophia to Arthur's door. Autumn had arrived. painting the leaves of the old oak tree in shades of gold and scarlet, but inside the sterling estate it was spring that was blooming. The silence, once a heavy shroud, had been replaced by the sound of laughter echoing through the halls, the patter of small feet on the marble staircase, and the gentle melody of Helena's piano, which Arthur now played clumsily while Sophia sang songs she had learned at the orphanage. The transformation of the house was a mirror of the transformation in their hearts. The white sheets were gone for good, replaced by vases of fresh flowers that Sophia insisted on picking from the garden. Helena's portrait was no longer a memorial to loss, but the smiling, loving presence of a wife and mother whose legacy was not pain, but the love that had brought two lost souls together. On that Saturday afternoon, the kitchen, once cold and pristine, was warm, messy, and alive. The air was thick with the familiar scent of honey, almonds, and cinnamon. Arthur, wearing an apron comically smeared with flour, watched as Sophia stood on a stool, stirring the copper pot with a fierce concentration that was so much like Helena's it ached. But it was a good ache, a healing ache. "More carefully, Dad," she scolded him with a laugh as he nearly dropped the jar of almonds. "Aunt Clara said the secret is the love you put into it." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, erasing years of sorrow. "You're right, Chef," he said, giving a mock salute. "Love is the main ingredient." They worked side by side in a comfortable, quiet dance, passing ingredients, mixing, tasting. They weren't just making sweets, they were weaving the fabric of their new life together, one thread at a time. They were honoring the past, not by clinging to it, but by bringing it into the present, transforming it into something new and beautiful. When the first batch of confections was ready, they wrapped them carefully in wax paper, just as Sophia had done on that rainy night. But this time, the basket wasn't for selling. Arthur and Sophia took the basket to the Havenwood Children's Home. The children greeted them with shouts of joy. Sophia, once the quiet girl in the corner, was now the hero, returning with sweets and stories of a new world. She passed out the treats, hugged her friends, and promised to visit often. Arthur watched from a distance, chatting with Mrs. Davison. The director looked at him with a new respect, seeing not the reclusive millionaire, but a devoted father. He had set up a substantial trust for the orphanage, ensuring the other children would have the opportunities Sophia now had. It wasn't charity, it was gratitude. On the way home, as the sun set, painting the sky in vibrant colors, Sophia rested her head on Arthur's shoulder in the car. "You know, Dad," she said sleepily, "sometimes I still feel like I'm dreaming." Arthur placed his hand over hers. "Me too," he whispered. "But if it's a dream, let's dream it together." That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep in her old room, now redecorated with her drawings of flowers and stars, Arthur went to the fireplace. He picked up his glass of bourbon, as he had every night. But then he hesitated. He looked at Helena's portrait. Her smile seemed different now. It was no longer an accusation, but a blessing. He no longer needed the alcohol to numb the pain, because the pain had transformed. He set the untouched glass on the table and sat in his armchair, not to mourn what he had lost, but to marvel at what he had found. The girl who had arrived as a rain-soaked peddler was not just his lost daughter. She was the key that had unlocked not only the door to his house, but the bolted doors of his heart. She had taught him that honoring the memory of a great love didn't mean living in a tomb of remembrance, but building a future where that love could continue to grow and flourish in new ways. The rain began to fall outside, a gentle drumming on the roof. But this time, it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like life. Arthur Sterling closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence of his house wasn't empty. It was full of hope, full of the promise of a new dawn.